Welcome to The Psychology of Us. This podcast is created by RJ Starr, a public intellectual and independent psychology educator. The material presented is educational and interpretive, examining psychological life as a domain of understanding rather than intervention. It does not provide therapy, diagnosis, or professional guidance. Each episode stands as a complete work of public psychological inquiry.
You know that person who walks into a room and just totally oozes confidence?
Oh, yeah. We all know one.
Right, like the one seamlessly dropping their Ivy League credentials into a totally casual chat.
Mm-hmm.
Or, they're delivering this flawless, bulletproof moral stance on, like, whatever the current issue of the day happens to be.
Mm-hmm.
And our immediate reflexive thought is usually, wow, they have it all figured out. They are so put together.
Right, because that's how we're trained to read it.
Exactly.
Mm.
But what if, and this is a big what if that exact behavior, that towering, seemingly impenetrable wall of confidence, is actually the ultimate proof that they are deeply, fundamentally insecure?
I mean, it completely flips the script on how we navigate human interaction. It really does. We're conditioned to read loud space-taking behavior as strength.
Yeah.
But when you start to pull back the layers, you often find this, architecture of sheer panic underneath it all.
A literal architecture of panic. And that panic, that hidden architecture, is the entire focus of our deep dive today. We are exploring the work of Professor RJ Starr, specifically this fascinating concept laid out in the essay, The Need to Be Seen External Witness and the Anchored Self.
That's such a brilliant piece of work.
It really is. And Starr introduces this idea of notice me behavior and external anchoring. So our mission today is to basically dissect how this psychological framework operates, look at the incredibly sneaky ways it shows up in our daily lives, and, figure out why our modern culture seems to aggressively demand this kind of behavior from us.
Right. It is a profound shift in perspective. But before we get into the actual mechanics of it, there's a crucial baseline we really need to establish here.
Okay, lay it on us.
So Starr is very careful to point out that notice me behavior is not like a personality flaw.
Wait, really? It's not a flaw?
No, it's not vanity either. It's not some clinical diagnosis of narcissism, right? We aren't here to casually throw around those psychological labels. Starr defines this as a structural pattern of identity.
A structural pattern.
Okay.
Okay, I want to speak directly to you listening for a second, because that distinction is everything. The goal for this deep dive isn't to arm you with, a new vocabulary to judge your coworkers or your friends.
Yeah, exactly. Don't do that.
Right, don't do that.
Right.
We are looking at a structural pattern, an orientation toward external witness as the primary way a person confirms that they even exist. And honestly, when you start looking at the world through Starr's lens, you realize we are all participating in this to some degree.
Oh, 100%. We all do it.
It completely changes how you view a tense boardroom meeting, or how you interpret your social media feed, or even how you examine your own motivations on a random Tuesday afternoon. So let's get into those mechanics. If this overwhelming display isn't confidence, what are we actually looking at here?
Well, we're looking at a self that requires ongoing external proof of its own reality.
Proof of reality.
Yeah. Think about that phrase Starr uses, external witness. For a person operating with this structural pattern, their internal sense of self is not a given. It's more like a proposition that has to be constantly validated by an audience. Without someone looking at them, reacting to them, or, acknowledging them, their internal world starts to feel painfully ambiguous.
Painfully ambiguous. So to wrap my head around this when I was reading the work, I kept visualizing a building.
Okay, I like that.
So imagine you are walking downtown, right? And you see this towering, magnificent skyscraper.
Mm-hmm.
It looks completely solid.
Very imposing.
Exactly. The glass is gleaming, the steel is heavy. It totally dominates the skyline. But if you were to somehow see beneath the street level, you would realize there is no bedrock foundation.
Right.
The entire core of the building is just hollow. The only reason this massive structure hasn't collapsed in on itself is because of a dense, intricate network of scaffolding bolted to the outside of it.
That's a great visual.
And the scaffolding is the audience, right? The scaffolding is the external witness. The building isn't showing off its height. It's literally relying on the scaffolding to remain standing.
That imagery captures the existential stakes perfectly. Because if you remove the scaffolding, if the audience simply walks away, the stability of that building is in immediate jeopardy.
It all comes crashing down.
Precisely. And this highlights a core insight from Starr's work regarding what is actually being transacted in these social moments. Because on the surface, it looks like a simple transaction for attention.
Right, look at me, look at me.
Exactly. But attention is just the behavioral currency. The psychological function underneath is a desperate search for ontological confirmation.
Okay, ontological confirmation. That is a very heavy academic phrase.
Yeah, it's a bit dense, yeah.
Let's make sure we really unpack that for the listener. So ontology is the philosophical study of being, right? It's the study of existence itself. So Starr is saying that individuals aren't just looking for a pat on the back, they're looking for confirmation that they exist.
Yes. They are seeking evidence that they exist in a specific, tangible way. Starr argues that the person exhibiting notice me behavior isn't merely after a round of applause or superficial praise. They are seeking actual proof of reality.
Wow.
They use the external world as a mirror, and they return to this mirror obsessively, not because they are inherently vain and love their own reflection, but because without the mirror, their own sense of self becomes terrifyingly opaque.
They don't know who they are unless someone else tells them.
Right.
That's incredibly poignant. It shifts the feeling from, being annoyed at that loud person in the room to feeling deep empathy for them.
It really does.
It makes me wonder about the alternative, though. If the externally anchored self is the hollow building propped up by scaffolding, what does the bedrock actually look like? What is a stable identity in Starr's framework?
So an internally coherent, stable identity experiences its own existence as a baseline fact. It is a given. Yeah. It does not function as a hypothesis that needs daily testing through social interaction. If you have an anchored self, your fundamental understanding of who you are does not swing wildly depending on how you are perceived in any isolated moment.
So you're not riding a roller coaster of validation every day.
Exactly. You could walk into a crowded room, stand in the corner, speak to literally no one, go entirely unnoticed, and you do not cease to be yourself. Your substance remains intact.
Which honestly sounds like a superpower in today's world.
Oh, definitely.
To have a self that exists prior to being witnessed, rather than a self that is generated by being witnessed, it implies a kind of emotional shock absorber.
That's a good way to put it.
Like if someone criticizes you, or worse, if they just completely ignore you, it might sting your pride, but it doesn't threaten your actual existence.
Right, the bedrock doesn't crack.
But for the externally anchored person, Starr suggests that periods of low visibility aren't just a bummer. They trigger a very specific kind of structural anxiety, don't they?
Yes, they trigger a profound agitation because the ground of their identity is literally located outside of their own body.
Wow.
It is held hostage by the perception of others. When visibility drops, the scaffolding shakes. And understanding that intense structural need for evidence brings us to one of the most fascinating layers of Starr's analysis, which is how adaptable this behavior is.
A chameleon effect.
Exactly. Notice me behavior is notoriously difficult to spot because it acts as a chameleon. It adapts to whatever value system the individual happens to operate within.
Right, because if the need for external proof is structural, it's going to use whatever tools are lying around to build the scaffolding. It's not just a stereotypical guy flexing his biceps in the gym mirror. The currency of the display completely changes depending on the environment, while the psychological engine running underneath stays exactly the same.
That is the core of the chameleon effect.
Let's look at how this manifests, starting with the most legible, obvious domain, the physical body.
Sure. The physical body is the easiest instrument for this behavior because of its immediate legibility. You don't have to explain your body to someone, it is simply seen.
Right, it's right there.
In Starr's framework, this is where we see the highly curated wardrobe, the meticulous documentation of gym progress, the constant broadcasting of athletic routines. The physical state becomes the primary vehicle to command a witness.
Okay, I'm going to push back on this a bit.
Go for it.
Because I think a lot of people listening might feel suddenly defensive here. Look, if I spend an entire year waking up at 5 a.m., grinding through terrible weather, and I finally run a marathon, I'm going to post a picture of my medal at the finish line.
Sure.
I mean, I'm going to want my friends to see it. Does that mean I'm suffering from an externally anchored identity crisis? Isn't there a place for genuine celebration?
It's a completely fair challenge, and Starr's work anticipates this exact friction. The answer lies in the distinction between the physical achievement itself and the psychological function of broadcasting it.
Okay, function.
Right. The marathon is real, the sore muscles are real, the dedication is genuine, but none of that changes the underlying question, which is what work is the public display doing for your sense of self?
Okay.
Starr proposes a simple thought experiment here. Imagine you cross the finish line, but your phone is dead.
Oh, no.
There are no photographers. Social media ceases to exist. No one in your life will ever know you ran that race. Does the achievement still hold its full weight and reality for you?
Oh. Oh, wow. That changes the texture of the question entirely.
Right. For an internally anchored self, the answer is yes. The physical reality of running the race is the reward. The post is just a bonus.
Oh, bonus, yeah.
But for the externally anchored self, an unremarked achievement feels hollow. It feels incomplete. It's as if the miles didn't fully happen till the audience verifies them. The display is required to finalize the reality of the event.
So if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to like the post,
Mm-hmm.
did it actually fall?
Basically, yeah.
For the externally anchored self, the answer is no. The audience is the final stamp of existence. Okay, I concede the point. That makes total sense.
It's a subtle but massive difference.
It really is. But the physical domain is easy, you know? Let's move into territory that is much subtler and, honestly, much more defensive.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the intellect.
Oh, this is a big one.
What happens when this need for scaffolding infects people who claim to be completely above superficial vanity?
It becomes incredibly camouflaged. In the intellectual domain, notice me behavior doesn't look like flexing in a mirror. It looks like the relentless display of credentials.
Right.
It is the person who forces highly specialized academic jargon into a casual conversation where a simple word would be much more effective.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
It's the strategic dropping of reading lists or obscure authors just to establish dominance. It is about prioritizing an intellectual hierarchy over actual clarity of communication.
I find this one deeply confronting, especially for anyone who works in a knowledge-based field or in academia.
Oh, academia is a hotbed for it.
Because in those environments, the culture actively rewards visible erudition. You are explicitly trained to show your work, to cite your sources, to use the precise terminology.
Exactly.
It makes the intellectual sphere the perfect hiding place for notice-me behavior, because you can always claim you're just being rigorous.
And that is exactly what makes it so insidious. You can hide a desperate need for external validation behind the guise of academic rigor.
Wow.
Starr draws a very sharp distinction here. It comes down to intent and function again. Is the specialized vocabulary being used because it is genuinely the only way to be precise about a highly complex idea?
Mhm.
If so, the showing is in service of the thinking.
The showing is in service of the thinking. Okay, I like that.
But if the vocabulary is being deployed primarily to ensure that everyone in the room knows you possess a master's degree or, to make others feel slightly less informed.
Right, to flex.
Yeah, then the thinking is merely in service of the showing. The intellectual content is just the scaffolding being used to crop up the ego.
That is so true.
And because professional cultures applaud this display, the individual can easily convince themselves they are simply a dedicated intellectual, completely blind to their own structural anxiety.
The thinking is in service of the showing. That perfectly captures the dynamic of the person who talks for 12 unbroken minutes in a strategy meeting without actually proposing a single actionable idea.
Yes, we've all been in that meeting.
They aren't communicating, they're establishing their ontological weight in the room, they're making sure you know they are there.
Exactly.
Which transitions us into the third domain, Starr outlines, one that happens in almost every casual social interaction we have: wit and social performance.
Humor is a fascinating mechanism to analyze through this lens.
How so?
Well, by definition, a joke requires a listener. It's a deeply social act. But Starr asks us to examine the underlying function of the humor in the moment. Is the joke an attempt to build a bridge of genuine social connection, or is it an audition for existence?
An audition. That phrasing is so brutally accurate. We all have that friend or that coworker who is undeniably funny, maybe even brilliant, but spending an hour with them leaves you feeling completely drained.
Yes.
It feels less like a conversation and more like you are a captive audience at a stand-up routine.
You feel drained because of the hidden energy transfer taking place.
Okay, unpack that.
Starr points out that an internally anchored person uses wit to connect. They offer a joke to lighten the mood. If the joke doesn't land or someone talks over it, it's fine. The social connection remains intact.
Right, it's no big deal.
But an externally anchored person experiences a failed joke as a microfracture in their identity. They don't just feel like they told a bad joke. They feel a sudden, terrifying drop in their own visibility.
So we track the room. They have that anxious hypervigilance, watching to see who laughed, who didn't, who was looking at their phone.
Exactly. Because the people in the room are not being enjoyed as companions, they are being utilized as mirrors.
Wow. Used as mirrors.
The laughter is the ontological confirmation. It is the audience saying, you are clever, you have value, you exist. When you are around someone operating like this, you intuitively sense that you aren't really a friend in that moment. You are scaffolding.
That explains the exhaustion.
Yeah.
You are literally doing the heavy lifting of maintaining their identity for them.
It's exhausting work.
It really is. So we've looked at the physical body, the intellect, and social wit. These are relatively common arenas where we expect to see egos clashing,
Sure.
But Starr's analysis gets truly provocative when it moves into domains that society usually shields from this kind of critique. Areas we consider sacred or deeply principled.
Yes, the advanced domains.
Exactly. Let's look at how external anchoring operates in the realms of morality, religion, and wealth.
Okay, so the domain of moral and political positioning is arguably one of the most pervasive and volatile forms of notice me behavior in contemporary culture.
Well, without a doubt.
And this is primarily because the digital tools available for public moral declaration have multiplied exponentially over the last decade.
I actually want to pause this right here for a very strict impartiality check.
Good idea.
We're speaking directly to you, the listener, and we need to make it explicitly, unconditionally clear that this analysis applies across the entire political spectrum.
Completely.
Left-wing, right-wing, centrist, libertarian, anarchist, it does not matter. We are absolutely not taking a stance on the politics themselves. Starr's work is not a critique of any specific ideology or political platform. We are analyzing the structural behavior of publicly announcing those politics.
That boundary is critical. The focus is entirely on the architecture of the display, not the content of the belief.
Right.
Starr approaches this by drawing a sharp line between genuine moral commitment and moral display. Genuine moral commitment is an internal governor. It dictates your behavior even when no one is watching and even when there is no social reward for doing the right thing.
It's the classic shopping cart theory.
Yes, exactly.
Like, do you return the shopping cart to the corral when it's raining, the parking lot is completely empty, and literally no one will ever know you did it?
Precisely. That is moral action operating in the dark. It doesn't require an audience to be valid, but moral display, as an externally anchored behavior, loses its urgency in the dark.
It has to be seen.
Right. The political position the person holds might be entirely real. They might genuinely care about the issue. But the announcement of it, the ostentatious performance of holding the correct belief, the yard sign, the bumper sticker, the viral post, is not serving an ethical function. It is serving an identity function.
So it's the difference between quietly setting up a monthly donation to a cause you care deeply about versus posting a screenshot of your donation receipt to your 5,000 followers.
Exactly.
The cause is real, the money is real, but the function of the public announcement is fundamentally different. The announcement is essentially saying, please see me as a good person so that I can believe I am a good person.
Yes. And because society places such a high premium on moral and ethical stances, this becomes an incredibly heavily armored form of display.
Armored. How so?
It's the ultimate camouflage. If you attempt to question the nature of the display, the externally anchored person can immediately accuse you of questioning the morality of the cause itself.
Oh, wow. That's a trap.
It is. They conflate their identity with the righteous cause, making it a highly effective, almost impenetrable hiding place for the unanchored self.
Which is brilliant, structurally speaking. You build your scaffolding out of something society says is untouchable.
Exactly.
And that brings us right to the doorstep of religious and spiritual identity.
Yeah.
This operates on a very similar frequency, doesn't it?
It does, and the irony is even sharper here.
Why is that?
Because religious and spiritual traditions inherently value depth, sincerity, humility, and inner transformation. But because these internal qualities are so highly prized by the community, the visible markers of possessing them become incredibly potent social signals.
It's the spiritual humble brag.
Oh, totally.
It's the person who manages to casually drop into conversation. Oh, I was just feeling so overwhelmed by the profound sense of universal oneness during my 3-hour silent meditation retreat this morning.
Exactly. And again, Starr isn't suggesting the spiritual experience wasn't real or that the meditation didn't happen.
Right.
He is pointing out that a person who is genuinely internally oriented toward their own spiritual growth doesn't require the external world to register it. The growth is its own evidence.
The bedrock is there.
Exactly. But if your spiritual identity is externally anchored, you have to find a way to make the invisible visible. You have to narrate the profound experiences. You have to visibly position your practice, your fasting, your prayer, your mindfulness relative to others to communicate a higher level of seriousness.
It's using the sacred as scaffolding. Starr makes a really bold comparison here, saying that for the unanchored self, spiritual depth functions the exact same way as a sports car.
That is the parallel he draws, yes, which provides a seamless transition into the domain of wealth and possessions.
Let's talk about that.
Material display is the oldest, most classically studied form of notice me behavior. We are all familiar with the concept of conspicuous consumption, buying extravagant things simply to show off status.
Right.
But Starr's analysis pushes past the surface-level critique of materialism.
Right, because the standard critique is just, oh, they're trying to keep up with the Joneses, they're obsessed with the social ladder. But Starr argues it isn't just about a crude status competition. What is actually happening with the luxury goods?
Status is just the social mechanism. The deeper psychological function is about using material legibility to make an internal condition externally readable.
Okay, break that down for me.
Imagine a self that feels entirely insubstantial. They feel light, ungrounded, completely lacking in internal weight or consequence. How does a self like that prove to the world and to itself that it has substance?
It surrounds itself with things that are undeniably substantial.
Heavy things, expensive things, highly legible things. The luxury car, the sprawling, meticulously curated home, the designer watch. In this framework, the possession itself is not the point.
What is it then?
The object is simply the mirror required to produce a reflection of substance. The unanchored self looks at the six-figure car in the driveway, and the internal logic dictates only a person of immense substance could own this. I own this, therefore I must be a person of substance.
The Rolex is the scaffolding. The Ferrari is the scaffolding.
Exactly.
This is mind-blowing. When you lay it out like this, you realize we are looking at the exact same psychological machine running underneath entirely different currencies.
It's the same engine.
Whether it is a sculpted bicep, a PhD, a brilliantly timed joke, a political yard sign, a spiritual retreat, or a massive house, the function is identical.
Completely identical.
But this brings me to a massive question. If this behavior is literally everywhere, if we are seeing it in the gym, in the lecture hall, at the political rally, in the driveway, why is it so incredibly pervasive? Are we just a fundamentally flawed, uniquely narcissistic generation? Have we all just collectively lost our minds?
That is the most vital question we can ask. And Starr's answer to this is perhaps the most profound and deeply forgiving point in the entire essay.
Okay.
We are not just a collection of flawed, vain individuals. External anchoring does not develop in a vacuum. It is a rational adaptation.
A rational adaptation. Let's
Yeah.
really dig into that. Meaning, this behavior isn't a bug in the human software. It is a feature of the system we are currently running.
Precisely. It is a learned, highly logical response to environments that systematically reward display over substance.
Right.
Think about the infrastructure of the modern world. If you live in a culture that distributes resources, attention, economic opportunity, and social approval based heavily on visibility rather than hidden, quiet quality, then optimizing your life for visibility is the smartest, most rational thing you can do to survive and thrive.
If the environment pays you for being seen, you are going to get really, really good at being seen. This immediately makes me think about contemporary digital culture. Social media obviously didn't invent the human need for external anchoring, but my God, it built an unprecedented, frictionless, global infrastructure for it.
It industrialized it. Starr refers to this as the monetization of attention. And your analogy of the building and the scaffolding applies perfectly here, but scaled up to billions of users.
It's crazy. I look at social media platforms, and to me, they operate identically to slot machines in a casino.
Oh, for sure.
But instead of paying out in quarters, they're specifically engineered to pay out in ontological confirmation.
Yes.
You pull the lever, you post the perfectly lit photo, the witty observation, the moral outrage, and you wait. And when the likes and the shares and the follower counts start rolling in, the machine is literally dispensing little microdoses of existence. Ding, 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 you are real. Ding, 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 you matter.
That is exactly how the architecture functions. It provides measurable, graduated, immediate feedback. It functions as a continuous psychological reinforcement schedule.
It's addictive.
Extremely. And Starr points out a critical, somewhat chilling reality. The platforms actually require users to experience their existence as contingent on audience response.
Wait, expand on that. The platforms require it.
Think about it. If you had a completely secure, internally anchored self, if your bedrock went 10 miles deep, you would not need to check your notifications 50 times a day. You wouldn't care.
You just post and walk away. Or not post at all.
Right. The platform maximizes its engagement and its profit by exploiting, and in many cases actively cultivating, that psychological state of external anchoring. That specific state of anxiety, the need for the mirror, is what makes the platform indispensable to the user.
Wow.
The platform provides the scaffolding, and in return, it harvests the attention.
We are the product, but our existential anxiety is the fuel. That is a dark realization.
And very dark.
And it doesn't stop at digital platforms. This ecosystem extends deep into our professional and academic lives through what Starr calls status economies and credential cultures.
Yes. Let's look at how the professional world operates. Identity is forced by necessity to become legible primarily through external markers. A resume, a job title, a university degree.
Right. The things you can put on paper.
These credential cultures have very few, if any, mechanisms for recognizing or rewarding qualities that cannot be displayed on a piece of paper or a LinkedIn profile. How do you quantify deep wisdom, quiet integrity, genuine empathy?
You can't put really good listener who quietly centers the team during a crisis on a resume in a way an automated HR algorithm can rank.
Exactly.
So what happens to a person navigating that system for decades?
The tragic result Starr identifies is the eventual collapse of the distinction between the credential and the self.
Oh, no.
Imagine someone who goes to an elite preschool, an elite high school, a top-tier university. From a very young age, they are handed pieces of paper that tell them what they are. They enter a corporate ladder that does the same thing. Society constantly asks them, "What are you?" And the only acceptable answer is their job title. Eventually, the brain simply accepts that premise. The internal self withers away from disuse because it is never called upon. You become the credential.
And that leads to devastating consequences, because if you are the credential, what happens when the credential is removed?
Exactly.
Think about a dedicated tech worker whose entire identity for 15 years is Senior VP of Engineering. Suddenly, the company downsizes. They're laid off. They don't just lose an income or a routine. They experience a literal collapse of the self. Because the scaffolding was removed and there was no building underneath.
That's it, exactly.
Yeah.
The self learned to locate its entire substance in the title rather than in its actual lived internal texture. And Starr makes a point here that should give us all pause. Anyone who emerges from sustained participation in these modern credential cultures with their internal life completely intact has usually done so despite the culture, not because of it.
Wow.
It requires active, conscious resistance.
That is a staggering thought. Active resistance against the way our world is structured. And it leads to another massive environmental factor. Starr brings up the normalization of comparative visibility.
Yes.
I really want to highlight for the listener how historically bizarre our current situation is.
It is entirely without historical precedent.
Right.
Yeah.
For the vast, overwhelming majority of human history, you only knew how you ranked against maybe 50 or 100 people in your local village. You knew who the fastest runner was, who the best storyteller was.
Your world was small.
Now, we have continuous, globally quantified metrics showing us exactly how we rank against billions of people, updated in real time.
We are entirely saturated in quantified comparison. Follower counts, 5-star ratings, engagement metrics, retweets. And Starr observes that for generations who've been raised entirely within this saturation, external anchoring isn't a dysfunction.
It's not.
No, it isn't some failure of psychological development. It is actually a perfectly accurate internalization of how their world works.
It is the water they are swimming in. If you have never experienced a reality where your value isn't publicly quantified and displayed, you have no experiential reference point for a self that doesn't require an audience. So of course you build scaffolding. Scaffolding is the only architecture you've ever been shown.
That's beautifully put.
Which brings us to the ultimate heartbreaking question of this deep dive. Let's say we adapt to the system perfectly. We play the game exactly as we were taught. We acquire the perfect sculpted body. We get the prestigious Ivy League degrees. We go viral. We receive the moral applause. We amass the wealth. The scaffolding is pristine, gleaming, and 50 stories high.
Mm-hmm.
Do we finally feel secure? Do we finally feel real?
The answer from Starr's framework is an unequivocal no.
No.
And the reason is not emotional, It is purely structural. The mechanism of external anchoring simply cannot accomplish what it is attempting to do. More witness does not make an unanchored self more real.
This is the tragedy of achievement in this framework. It's the moving goalpost. 10,000 followers feels like it will be enough until you get 10,000 followers, and suddenly the anxiety is back.
Right.
The prestigious credential finally settles the imposter syndrome for about 3 weeks. I do have a pushback here, though. Let's really look at human nature. Isn't this just how we are wired?
How do you mean?
Aren't we always just wanting more no matter what?
Yeah.
Hedonic adaptation, right? We get the nice thing, the baseline of our happiness adjusts, we get used to it, and then we want a nicer thing.
Yeah.
Isn't Starr just describing basic human greed?
That is a very common counterargument, and it makes intuitive sense.
Sure.
We are familiar with the hedonic treadmill, the idea that the thrill of a new purchase or a new status fades. But Starr rebuts this brilliantly by pointing out that what we are dealing with here is not a pleasure failure, it is a structural failure.
A structural failure.
Yes. The goalpost moves not because we are infinitely greedy, but because the instrument being used, external confirmation, is fundamentally incapable of reaching the target, which is internal grounding.
Oh, I see. It's not the hedonic treadmill. It's like trying to quench your thirst by drinking salt water.
Yes. Great analogy.
You aren't infinitely thirsty because you have a greedy, insatiable appetite for water. You are thirsty because the specific thing you are drinking is fundamentally incapable of hydrating you. In fact, the salt water is actively making the dehydration worse.
That is the exact mechanism. External confirmation can successfully address your external position. It can elevate your status, increase your rank, and expand your influence.
But it doesn't touch the inside.
No, it cannot address the absence of an internal ground. You cannot import internal substance from the outside. It's a structural feature of pursuing the wrong solution to the actual problem. And this framework perfectly explains a phenomenon that often completely baffles the public: why massive, world-class success actually makes notice me behavior worse.
Yes. You see these incredibly famous, wealthy, successful people who are still out there desperately acting out, seeking attention, picking fights with random people in comment sections. And from the outside, you look at them and think, you have literally everything a person could want. Why do you still care what a stranger thinks?
They care because they have finally encountered the structural limit of the mechanism. They achieved the massive, undeniable external recognition they genuinely believed would finally settle the internal void. They got the mirror they wanted, and they looked into it, and they discovered that it didn't work. Wow. The reflection is still empty. But the logic of external anchoring is internally coherent, even though it's fatally flawed.
I'm stuck on that phrase. What do you mean by internally coherent?
Well, if your internal operating system genuinely deeply believes the premise that audience attention equals reality, and you achieve massive audience attention but still feel unreal, the only logical conclusion your system can draw is, I must not have enough audience attention yet.
Oh my God.
The solution to the failure of display is never to abandon the display. The logic dictates that you must simply increase the display.
So the logic demands endless escalation. If the 1 million followers didn't make me feel whole, I must need 10 million. If the Ferrari didn't do it, I need a yacht. If the PhD didn't do it, I need to completely destroy my rival in a public debate. It's a closed, terrifying loop.
It is a feedback loop that can run indefinitely. Display, recognition, a brief moment of temporary stabilization, renewed existential need, and then renewed escalated display. And the crucial point Starr makes is that there is no exit within the loop's own logic. The machine cannot turn itself off.
So how does it end? How does someone actually get out of that loop and find bedrock?
Starr points out that the exit always has to come from outside the loop's logic. It might come from a radical change in environmental conditions that makes a different orientation possible, like intentionally stepping away from the digital platforms or exiting a hyper-competitive credential culture.
Right.
It might come from a gradual, often painful awakening to the pattern itself, usually through therapy or deep introspection. Or, very often, it comes from total systemic exhaustion.
The person literally cannot maintain the energy required to keep the scaffolding up anymore. They just collapse.
Exactly. But none of these exits are guaranteed. If the environmental conditions remain and the energy holds out, the loop can run for an entire lifetime.
That is a profoundly sobering thought. An entire lifetime spent meticulously maintaining the scaffolding, constantly terrified of the wind, never once realizing the building inside is hollow.
It is sobering.
Okay, as we move toward the end of our time, let's pull all of these complex threads together. We have covered an immense amount of ground today, analyzing human behavior through a completely different paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
What is the core structural observation from Starr's work that we need to hold on to?
The synthesis is this notice me behavior is not a moral failing. It is a highly legible, entirely rational adaptation to the infrastructure of the modern world. It operates as a desperate, ongoing attempt by an unanchored self to become real through the eyes of an audience.
Mm-hmm.
It will use whatever currency is highly valued by its environment. Physical beauty, intellectual dominance, moral purity, spiritual depth, or material wealth. But the underlying psychological function is always exactly the same. And tragically, it is a mechanism structured in a way that inherently prevents its own resolution.
And to bring this directly back to you, the listener, why does this deep dive matter? Why spend all this time dissecting Professor RJ Starr's framework? Because recognizing this structural pattern fundamentally changes how you view every interaction in your life.
Completely.
When you encounter that supremely confident person we talked about at the very beginning of the show, the one dominating the room, seamlessly dropping the credentials, demanding to be seen, you no longer just see arrogance. You have a new lens. You can see the underlying vulnerability. You see the scaffolding. You realize that what looks like an intimidating display of power is often just a very quiet plea for existence.
That's right.
It replaces our knee-jerk judgment with an analytical, structural empathy. And perhaps even more importantly, it gives you a framework to audit your own life. Before you post that photo, before you speak up in the meeting just to be heard, before you buy the thing you don't really need, you can pause and ask yourself, am I doing this to share something real? Or am I doing this to prove to myself that I exist?
It shifts our focus from the superficial content of our behavior to the deep ontological conditions of our identity. It asks us to bravely examine where exactly we have located the ground of our own reality.
Exactly. And that leads me to the final lingering question we want to leave you with today. It's inspired by Starr's work, but it pushes us to think beyond just the immediate discussion we've had about society and platforms.
Okay.
We've seen how our culture, our economies, our digital spaces, our professional ladders has rigorously trained us to outsource our very existence to the audience. We are builders who have become absolute masters of scaffolding. But if that is true, what happens to the self when you finally close the door, when you put down the phone, and the audience goes completely permanently silent? Who is left in the room?
That is the ultimate question.
Keep questioning the structures around you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
This has been The Psychology of Us. The work presented here is part of a public psychological archive by RJ Starr. It is educational and interpretive, not clinical or advisory. Episodes are published as finished reflections and are intended to be encountered as complete works.